if you're able to give tips on navigating through propaganda and understanding the truth. How do you know what is real out there? How do we know that we are that our analysis are correct and that we're speaking the
Yeah,
truth to the best of our ability?
right.
It's very difficult ways. I will
It
sit
is.
down and I'll watch Fox News or I'll see the other side and I'm like, just a completely different world
Right.
than what I understand and what I obviously, I believe to be correct. I believe that
Hmm.
I'm being rational and that my understanding of the facts here, these make much more sense just logically than what I'm seeing on the news. But there are different worlds that, depending
Hmm.
on where you get your information,
Oh
you
yeah.
live in a different realm. So for people out there, how do they know what's real? How do you ascertain and do these reality checks that uh,
Yeah.
on a regular basis? How
Yeah.
do you know?
Yeah. Well, I think um, I think you need to perform tests, like I think I was saying in a maybe it was the last um, podcast that we did from time to time. You can't do it every day, it's just because you come to trust certain news sources. And I think just every once in a while, you have to ask yourself, okay, I've been trusting this news source for a year or 2 years or something. You know, okay, now they're making this claim. Does this really make sense? I'm not quite sure. Let's just watch it and see. And I know this other news source is saying something different. Let's see what happens. Okay, I think you occasionally have to step back and perform a test. You could call it a reality check. There are certain times in my life when I've done that and I've changed. You know, I I abandoned news sources that I used to some extent rely on. I'll say I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but going way back, like around, okay, I never really relied on, but going back prior to the Iraq War, I would actually read National Review, and which is the flagship conservative mainstream publication, and they were all very pro-war, and um, and yeah, they were sure that there were weapons of mass destruction, for example. And of course the war was launched and they were saying, okay, well, if they're right and there really were weapons of mass destruction, maybe this war was justified. Actually, I didn't even think it was even on those terms, I remember. But let's just see, if they're right about this claim. And then the months went by and months went by. And I remember reading an article in the National Review. It would be just almost too horrible to contemplate the fact that there might not be weapons of mass destruction. And then that was the last time it was ever mentioned. They never found it. And then, but they just kind of let it go and continue. I said, these are not serious people. This is not a reliable news source. Occasionally, everybody will get something wrong, but you have to be open about it and correct yourself, right? They didn't. So I just said, okay, forget them. And, I went to other uh, news sources um, that I felt were more honest. Now, another time is also, I think, another thing you can do is is really deeply research the subject. Maybe there's some news story that you're hearing about, and it doesn't actually seem quite right, or just it raises questions in your minds, and you think, I'm not getting the full story. Actually, read a book, okay? Actually, learn the history. And that's actually what I did with Palestine, going way, way back in the 1980s. And I remember, it was just another one of these stories, and you could see these rock throwing Palestinians, and I just started thinking, well, why are they throwing these rocks? And there was just kind of a typical, I don't know, expressions of concern and the usual statements about, age-old conflicts or whatever. And I said, but why are these guys throwing rocks? And I actually did read the books, and that's where my eyes were really open, and I understood. Okay, now I know this history. Now I know why they were throwing the rocks. If I was there, I would be throwing a rock too, right? So you need to dig in deeply occasionally and just get away from just the surface news source and then come back to it, and you can understand. You can make a much more informed judgment. Something similar happened in the case of the Georgian War, and what was it in 2008? I think it was in August 2008, um, because at that time, your brother had just come back from Georgia. He could speak Georgian. He could read Georgian. And he also knew you could also read Russian. And he had been telling me while he was still there that Saakashvili, the president of Georgia, was crazy and was going to start a war. And then sure enough, he comes back and the war gets started. But it's immediately blamed on the Russians. All the Russians have just, have invaded Georgia unprovoked. But he was following the reports in real time. And it was clear as day that it was the Georgians that had attacked Russia and killed Russian peacekeepers. And Russia responded as any major power would, and actually, I think really responded with constraint, but taught Georgia a lesson, and we know what the results of that. But the thing is that okay, that was something where I was getting, let's say, inside information, somebody who really knew Georgia. Now these reporters, these people don't know anything about Georgia. That's one thing. They don't know the language, they don't know the history, they don't know anything, but they get their instructions from the State Department. They blame everything on Russia. And it was at that point that I really realized how wrong our news could be. I always knew that there could be like mistakes of emphasis, oversimplifications. But this was a case where black and white were just reversed. We're pretending that it was one side invading the other when it was the other way around. And then I think it was 2 months later, like an article came out in the New York Times, which essentially describes what really happened. But it was in the back pages of the New York Times and never got aired. So that was really an eye-opening event for me, where I just saw how narratives are manufactured. Like that narrative of the unprovoked Russian aggression has never stopped. Even the EU did a study and admitted, okay, yeah, Georgia started this, but it never really interfered with the narrative. So again, you just need to get below the surface. You need to, maybe read some books focus on one particular thing. You can't read about everything and know everything in depth, but find something and learn about it in depth, and then go back, and then you find out who's telling the truth and who isn't. Or you have connections with people that actually live there, who actually know the language, and they can tell you about what's going on. And of course, that too has happened with your sister here, who's been describing life to Russia. Yeah, in Russia, she's been here for more than 4 years, and again, it just again and again it contradicts the things that the impression you would get of life in Russia if you were just following U.S. news. Yeah, so that's right. Just look beyond the curtain, and find out what's going on behind the stage there, what's really going on. We can't do that
Well,
every day, but I would just say that by,
right,
focusing on certain things, doing the real research, attaining a real understanding, then you go back and you say, okay, who's reliable? Then you could learn to trust certain news sources. And again, those news sources should be
right,
honest, because everybody makes mistakes, and you don't want, like National Review just decided, okay, we're just going to pretend we never said this, but of course that's everything they were saying. But like the Durand, Alexander Mercouris, he'll say, okay, I don't really know about this. This is what I think will happen. Then later he'll say, okay, yeah, I got that wrong. I think that's an example too of somebody who's really honest and trying to learn the truth. So that for example is one good news source.
can you name maybe your top three news sources that you recommend for listeners?
Um, Well, I would say actually on Russia, there's somebody who doesn't get much attention, but he's living here in Moscow, married to a woman from Crimea who has relatives throughout eastern Ukraine. So he's really plugged in. He knows Russian well, really plugged into what's happening here in Russia, and a very smart guy. That's Mark Sleboda. And you'll find him on shows like the Rachel Blevins show, or what is it, Dialogue Works. That's the Brazilian who does that. Um, and he's also regularly appears on Sputnik and I think occasionally on RT too. But I find him to be very good. You know, I, he usually gets it right when he predicts things too. I mean, nobody ever gets everything right, but he's actually very cautious. He describes himself as a professional cynic. somewhat jokingly, but it's just like,
Mhm.
yeah, he's very pro-Russian, but he's quick to admit when the Russians make a mistake, and he's never been over optimistic. There are a lot of people on the, let's say, the pro-Russian side who just assumed that Russia was going to win this war in 3 months, and he said, no, 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 that's not what's going to happen here. This is going to be a long, hard slog, and he's always been right about that. I think he's a very reliable source. Again, very well plugged in here. Understands in part because of all his family connections, what's really happening in eastern Ukraine. Um, so he's one very good source. And then on like the war in Gaza, I think Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate are excellent. Max Blumenthal in particular just seems to really know Israeli politics inside out. And so I find him as a wonderful source for that. Of course, he works for the Gray Zone, which in general is a good source for geopolitics. I would say a very good source for geopolitics. Consortium News. They're both leftist oriented. So actually, I get people who sometimes like I would say even with like Max Blumenthal to call him a leftist, I don't think it really even means anything anymore. I don't think he finds most of his time he's attacking the liberals, um, but he also there's yeah, in some ways you could call him a leftist. Those categories just don't quite mean what they once meant. So there are uh, people like Aaron Mate, again, Max Blumenthal, the Gray Zone, the Consortium News. You would consider those leftists, but then they're called by mainstream liberals. They're accused of being, far on the far right, which is ridiculous. Uh, but then you also get people like, yeah, Douglas McGregor, all those people who are clearly conservatives, but they end up having
Scott
very
Ritter or
similar.
Larry Johnson.
Larry Johnson, right? Phil Giraldi, but their analyses are essentially the same that you're going to get from Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal. I mean, they're in total agreement, and I think they're just all being honest about what's happening. Uh, it really has nothing to do with they've moved beyond ideology. Um, yeah. So anyway, those are some. I'm probably not. Well, one person I think is really always very good on geopolitics, extremely experienced is Chas Freeman, who again he was a remarkable man. He was the interpreter for Richard Nixon, and when he went to China, so you can see what kind of career he has. He was an ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He's a person with extensive knowledge, of very high intelligence, and um, I yeah, I have the utmost respect to him for him. And by the way, sometimes like I almost think that we're getting carried away talking about the ultimate destruction of Israel or whatever, or gotten to the point where people look at Israel and say maybe it needs to end the state. In one of his more recent interviews, he basically said the same thing. Again, this is this guy is probably is a legend within U.S. diplomacy, and that's the conclusion that he's reached.
Right. So I think that it's becoming more and more of a consensus as time goes on. The state of Israel is becoming irredeemable, and diplomacy is not an option anymore. It's a real shame, and it's scary. We'll see what it means. Well, one last question. I know we're running a little over. Um, is if when I would say instead of even if at this point, when Israel no longer exists as the state it is now, what does that mean for the United States and the U.S. political system?
Yeah. Um, I just don't have an answer for that. It's just because we're so deeply intertwined with them. It's going to be a wrenching experience, let's say, for the U.S. body politic, and I I don't know, but it's going to have revolutionary effects. I think that's all I can say. Again, I think is I used the metaphor of the Pandora's box, or used that as an analogy recently,
Mm,
and that's what I would say. I don't know what's coming because I don't think anybody can predict the kind of things that have happened over the last several years. I just know that there's going to be more craziness, more upheaval, and certainly an event like that. like the end of the state of Israel, because there are so many
Yeah.
people in this country, very powerful people, and that are very closely tied to Israel, identify with Israel, and I, I just, I think it's inconceivable. It's just the United States won't be the same country after that happens. That's all I'll say.
Hmm. Right. It's like removing a tumor from a patient, and we'll see if the patient survives and recovers
Right?
and how it'll be afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll end here. I guess we should just add one more real good news source. Will be you, Peter, on Conversations Among the Ruins. So that's also a very reliable news source to get information what's going on in the world. Okay, Dad. Let's end it there. All right.
Okay.
Have a good rest of your day.
All right.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye.